Okay, I'm going to just do a little bit of a review and then get into something you may say is a non sequitur. It doesn't have anything to do with the lesson, but it has a lot to do with the lesson. We were looking at Josiah and the discovery of the book, and this is entitled A Quick Review. Just a little bit about Josiah. He was actually one of the last kings that the Jews actually had in Jerusalem. He was a great-grandson of the great Hezekiah. His grandfather was Manasseh, who was one of the most wicked kings that the Israelites ever had, that the people in Judah ever had, who lived 55 years, reigned 55 years, and succeeded by his son Amon, who was as bad as Manasseh, but fortunately was assassinated very quickly and left behind a child, namely Josiah. We don't know who it was, but somebody picked up Josiah as a baby and they raised him until he was 8 years old. And when he was 8 years old, we find that he was made the king. 8 years old, he was born in, I think the previous slide shows you that he was born, we want to keep that day, he was born in 648. Keep that in mind because it'll become pertinent. He became the king. Now, actually, we don't know who brought him up, but he was very different from his father and from his grandfather, more like his great-grandfather. And as he was growing up, he became aware of certain things that were important as far as the Israelites were concerned, namely their temple. He found out there was some money that had been put aside to refurbish the temple, and in the refurbishing of the temple, we find that they discovered a book in that temple, which astonished them when they read it. They took it to Josiah, who we're told he had it read to him, and what the book amounted to was this, and I will talk a lot more about this book sometime in the future. It was supposedly a sermon that was given by Moses just as the Israelites were about to cross the River Jordan and get into the Promised Land. Moses supposedly wrote this book and told the people the following: if you obey my laws, my commandments, you will prosper in the Promised Land. If you're not, you're going to have difficulty. That was the beginning, you might say, of what I sometimes refer to as the Deuteronomic Theology. The righteous will be rewarded and the wicked will be punished. What Josiah interpreted here is that all we have to do is to take a look at our own background, and there are a lot of things that we ought to be very concerned with that do not seem to be following what we have in this book. And he instituted what you might call a situation where he carried out sort of a revolution, changed everything. And it is often referred to in the manner in which he had conducted this, of getting rid of anything that did not pertain to what the Israelites should be doing in terms of their worship. All of the idols, well, as a matter of fact, he goes on for a whole chapter of all the different things that he destroyed in this particular revival. These are a couple of pictures that I found of showing the things of getting rid of the idols, of getting rid of the high places, of getting rid of anything that was an abomination in the temple, doing away with it completely. Here is a very interesting picture. In the background, you see them burning some of the materials that were confiscated, some of the idols, some of the Asherah, some of the things that were abominations as far as Josiah was concerned, and Josiah being read the book at the same time. Then we get a very interesting statement. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all of the law of Moses, nor did any like him come after him. Still, the Lord did not turn away from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger had kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations in which the Manasseh had provoked. In other words, in this particular particular part of the scripture, saying, okay, you may have carried out all these renovations, you may have carried out this revival, but still there is the chance that you're going to be punished. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and will cast off the city which I have chosen, Jerusalem, the house in which I said, my name shall be there. A great statement. Look at the next couple of verses. And the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh slew him at Megiddo when he saw him. That's it. Josiah was killed. Actually, he was only 39 years old when he was killed. He had carried out this great reformation, and now he was dead. By the king of Egypt? What's Egypt got to do with it? What's the Euphrates got to do with it? Here are a couple of things that we have from the book of Chronicles I found kind of interesting, because Chronicles says a lot more about the death of Josiah. As a matter of fact, we found a couple of pictures of Josiah being struck by a stray arrow during the battle at Megiddo, where the battle was fought, and being carried back to Jerusalem in a chariot where he died. These are all things that you'll find in the Bible. Now, here's a slide that I made up myself. You see, it's very exact. All time periods are approximate. The reason being is that you can find almost any time period you want, any particular time you want, if you look long enough. But you'll notice something that I've done here is take a look at the different periods that we've looked at and we can look at in the Bible. Like in the beginning, we had the creation of the Tower of Babel, then we had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then the return from Egypt. That we're going to cover in a few weeks. Then there's a period called the Pre-Monarchy, between Joshua, Judges, and Samuel. This was before the kings came on, Saul, David, and Solomon. And right after Solomon, there was a divided kingdom, and then we have the northern kingdom, which is all of Israel. You'll see a little bit more of that later on. And the southern kingdom, which was Judah. You notice something here? I changed the color. When Josiah went out to meet Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo, that was the end of you might say, the end of the period in which you would say Israel, the Israelites, actually had a country. From there on, they are always vassals to some other big power. Starting out here with Egypt. Well, Pharaoh was, Josiah was killed by the Egyptians. The Egyptians took over. And they had a long period, 4 years? That was only 4 years, and all of a sudden the Babylonians come on the scene. The Babylonians lasted until 539, when the Persians come on the scene. After the Persians, after a couple hundred years of the Persians, came the Greek period, and finally the Roman period. All this time, the Israelites, the Jews, the people that are in Judah, were were vassals of some other country. I did not continue this, but if you continue this situation of being subjected to some other ruler and always being under some other ruler, does anybody know how long that lasted? Until 1947. It wasn't until the partitioning of Israel, partitioning of Palestine in 1947 after World War II, that the Jews were actually given some territory of their own. There is a period here now of how many years? This was 600 BC until 1900, almost 2,500 years, where the Jews had, guess what? Who was their king? They didn't have a king. They didn't even have a high priest. They didn't even have for the most part, they didn't even have a temple. They certainly had no country. Why did they last so long? You ever wondered about that? How did the Jews manage to last such a long period and maintain themselves without having any of the attributes that you would expect to have if you were going to be a successful country? I thought about that quite a while. And most people come up with a very quick answer. During that whole long period after Josiah was killed, during that long period, they had two things that were going for them. One of them was the Bible. Now, you will find out that the Bible starts to come into being about this time. But guess what the other thing is that I found was quite interesting? There were some very, very strong relationships that the Jews had amongst themselves in terms of their families. Their family was of utmost importance. If you go to the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, very often you'll see the name of somebody, and he was the son of such and such. Sometimes even the grandson. In other words, they tell us something about the family. Family was very significant. When we get to the Ten Commandments, one of the commandments is what? Honor your father and mother. This became a very significant thing as far as the Jews were concerned, is to have that strong relationship with their family. You were honored when you were born into a family, and it was going to be your responsibility to maintain the stature of your family and the dignity of your family, and possibly even add to it and make the family even better. Now, my own experience was kind of interesting. I got to know a couple of Jews really quite well, one of them in particular, and I was quite surprised what a strong relationship that guy had with his father. Even though his father was not necessarily a practicing Jew, there was a very strong relationship. I can remember him saying to me, we were graduate students at Chicago at the time, saying to me that there was nothing that made his father prouder than the fact that he was going to school. And you know what his father was? His father was a blind robin salesman. And you know what a blind robin is? I had a lot of fun with this guy. A blind robin, you know those little salted herrings you see in a bar? Those are called blind robins. I didn't know that. Cy taught me that. And his father apparently had a franchise in the Chicago area and was quite wealthy. All I know is that Seymour had a car. But the relationship between him and his father, even though they were miles apart in so many different ways, was very, very strong. I found that out with some other families that I got to know, that this family relationship was so important. Now, the reason I'm going to bring that up is sometime later you're going to be asking a question, how did they manage to keep this particular idea alive for 300 years? Well, they were able to keep this relationship that they had as a people for, 2,500 years. And I think it was largely because of the fact they had the Bible, they had the Hebrew Bible, and they had these family relationships. But from this point on, we have to remember that the Jews were not a nation. As a matter of fact, just to carry the history a little bit further, by the time we get to Jesus, they were under the control of Rome. That lasted through a rebellion in 70 AD. Now that's right after Paul's death. I think Paul died about that time. And then another rebellion, 125 or 130 AD, 130 years after Christ, when Hadrian, the emperor, as I recall reading, had forbidden any of the Jews from even coming into the city of Jerusalem. And I think I read at one place the Jews were not even allowed to buy land in Palestine. In other words, they had nothing, and yet they maintained themselves for all these centuries. This is a little bit about Josiah. I'm putting this in again to recall the dates here that are important. He was born in 48. He died in 609. He was 39 years old when he died. And he died in Jerusalem. I may come back to that slide again sometime later. And this is the non sequitur. I want to talk about the Assyrian Empire. And the title that I had at the beginning was a very short history. It was short when I started, but I kept finding things that I thought I ought to be talking about a little bit. When I started on this Assyrian Empire, I was reminded of one of my favorite cartoons, which I cannot find on the internet, but love to be able to get a hold of it. It's a man walking into a room, and on a leash, he has a 2-ton elephant. And the host says to him, "What are you doing with that elephant?" His reply was, "What elephant?" It's kind of interesting when you get to the Bible, you find out that there is very often an elephant in the room. And during this period that we're looking at right now, there was a very sizable elephant in that room in the history of these people. They were being controlled very much by what was going on the outside rather than what was on the inside. I was thinking of an analogy about the political situation in the Netherlands in terms of finding a mayor in Amsterdam in 1939 and 1940. Do you think they were very concerned about finding a mayor in Amsterdam in 1939 and 1940 when the Nazis were knocking at their door ready to? That was the big elephant that was in the room. The same thing was true here. The Assyrians were very prominent during this period. Now, the Assyrian Empire is very old. If you take a look at this map that I have on the next slide, this was the original Syrian Empire, and it goes all the way back to about 2020, about the time shortly after Sargon. This darkened area is how far it got by about 1300 BC. That's about 600 years, about the time that the Israelites came into Palestine. Then we have all of this material, all of this territory, all the way down into Egypt. The Assyrian Empire, for all practical matters, had this whole Mesopotamian situation, this whole part of the Near East, and even down into the great empire of Egypt. Here's another picture of it showing that map. This times it a little bit. You'll notice that at around this is during Isaiah's time, around 700. The Assyrians had not gotten into Judah yet. The Assyrians had gotten into Palestine, and we'll see a little bit more of that later on. But keep this in mind that as far as Judah is concerned, that means Jerusalem and Lachish. The Assyrians hadn't gotten there yet. Here's a list of the Assyrian kings. If you could memorize this very quickly, I'll point it out here. It goes all the way back to Ashurbanipal II. That takes it around 850. But the real beginnings is right here. Tiglath-Pileser III in 740 BC. Tiglath-Pileser started a campaign to do the same thing that some other emperors had done, is to try to conquer the known world. And he was rather successful. I don't want to leave this map yet other than to point out who he was followed by: Shalmaneser, Sargon, Sennecraft. These are all rather significant people, all the way down to Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. I never took the time to learn how to pronounce his name, because look at the rest of it. It was under his reign that the Assyrian Empire fell. Now, you may find this rather strange, but our interest in the Assyrian Empire, as far as Josiah is concerned, is that period where the empire was falling apart. It was very powerful, but at the time of Josiah, it was falling apart. You'll notice that, well, if you look at those dates, you'll find this at this point, Josiah would have been somewhere in his early or mid-20s. He'd be about 20 years old, 22 years old or so. Very young when that empire started to fall apart. Keep that in mind. Here's a somewhat better map, a better genealogy. Here it started with Tiglath-Pileser. He started this conquering in 745. Takes us all the way down to Ashurbanipal. Well, here are three names that I never bothered, because after Ashurbanipal, this whole Assyrian Empire starts to fall apart, and this is about the time that Josiah is in his early 20s or maybe his mid-20s. He's watching that empire fall apart. But now, what about that empire? Let's take a quick look at it. Tiglath-Pileser was a very successful administrator in many regards, and he was responsible for bringing a lot of the territory that we have in Mesopotamia under the control of the Assyrians, and even managed to take things all the way down up to this point. Tiglath-Pileser never really got into Judah. He never really even got into northern Israel. We'll see it in just a moment. You notice this is not green yet. It becomes a little bit green. Tiglath-Pileser died around 627 BC. Around 627 BC, he is gone, and he's followed by Shalmaneser. Here we see these are, like I say, these are some of my notes. Here is a map of Israel, or of Palestine. This is the division between the northern tribes and up here and Judah. The northern tribes are these tribes up here. Here is the sea, the Dead Sea. Here's the Sea of Galilee. And centered right around here are 4 tribes that we don't hear too much about: Naphtali, Issachar, Zebulun, and Asher. They are mentioned in the Bible, but we don't know that much about them. Manasseh and Ephraim are also northern tribes. These are supposedly all sons of Jacob. Ephraim and Manasseh are sons of Joseph. Benjamin, of course, was also a son of Jacob. Dan later on moves way on up over here. We'll see a little bit more of that later. I got a little bit better map. I got one in color that actually shows things. Judah and Simeon, Reuben, these are originally tribes of the sons of Leah. This is from the Bible. This is from Kings. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Israel captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria and settled them in Hala, at the river Habor, at the river of Gozan, and the towns of Media. All right, just one statement. What happened? The king of Assyria. Now, that king of Assyria at that time was first was Tiglath-Pileser, but in 627, Tiglath-Pileser died, and his son Shalmaneser took over. And Shalmaneser was the one that actually moved into Samaria and took control of Samaria. There's the fall of Samaria. Well, it didn't. It fell. It was the end of Samaria. Sometime in the next month or two, we'll talk about where Samaria comes into the scene. And what Shalmaneser did and Tiglath-Pileser did was essentially the same thing, and it's shown on the next slide, is that they took care of the captured lands they had by doing one thing, and that is get the people that were living there out of there. If you leave them there, you're going to have problems. And they became very, very intent on deporting people, and I think I have a dozen? Deporting of the Israelites. Here we show a mass of Israelites being deported. I should mention one thing, however, that I think is rather important. Even though a large number were being deported to the places that I show here, before Shalmaneser actually got into Samaria and conquered Samaria, guess what a lot of the people in the north did? A lot of the people in those tribes of Israel did. They fled to the south and they went down to Judah. For some reason, the Assyrians were reluctant to go into Judah right away, and they sought refuge in Judah. Do you remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about the king in Judah at that time was Hezekiah, and there was a big increase in the population in Judah owing to all these people that came from the north settling in Judah. But let's do a little bit more here. These purple lines are some of the people that were deported by Tiglath-Pileser. The ones that came out of Samaria are by the yellow lines. Here's another thing that was very significant. Once they had deported these people, once they got them out, they split them up as fast as they could. I read somewhere that these emperors did not want to keep more than 2 or 3 families in any one location. Why? Because they could form a coalition and probably fight against them. They preferred to keep them split. They spread them out as far as they could, possibly could, into other parts of the Assyrian Empire. What do you think happened after just 2 or 3 generations? They disappeared. And sometimes we refer to these people that disappeared as the lost 10 tribes of Israel, because nobody knows what happened to them. They were simply assimilated into the population. But this deportation became rather significant as far as the Syrians were concerned. Here are some things that are actually from the scriptures. The king of Assyria brought the people from Babylon, from Cuthal, Ava, Athan, and so on, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the people of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and dwelt there. That makes sense. They're going to put people in another place. Why not take the people that they are conquering from there and bring them back to Samaria? And they did. They brought a bunch of them back to Samaria, and they were not, well, they probably were Semitic, but they were not descendants of Abraham or anything. They were people that moved into Samaria. They were, guess what they called them? Samaritans. Now, those of us that are brought up in the Christian traditions associate that word Samaritan with what other word? Good. We know the story of the Good Samaritan. But if you read the New Testament carefully, you find out that Jesus himself was actually censured because of something that he had done, and sat at a well and had a conversation with a Samaritan woman. And a good Jew like Jesus would not talk with a Samaritan, but he talked with a Samaritan. The Samaritans were looked down upon. At the beginning of their dwelling there, they did not fear the Lord. Therefore, the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. We get a very strange story here. A story in which we find the lions are coming into Samaria and killing them. Lions in Samaria, you go back into the book of Samuel, you find out that David, when he was auditioning for the job of trying to kill Goliath, what did he tell Saul? I have killed lions and bears. In other words, there were lions apparently living in Palestine at this time. And these lions were giving these people in Samaria a lot of problems. The story goes is that what they wanted to do was to find a way around this. So the king of Assyria was told, the nations which you have carried away and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the law of the God of that land. Therefore he has sent lions among them, and behold, they are killing them, because they do not know the law of the God of the land. And the king of Assyria commanded, send there one of the priests whom you have carried away there, and let him go and tell them about the law of the land. Now, this is where the Samaritan situation gets rather interesting, to say the very least, because they did adopt the law of the land. They became like the Israelites in Judah. As a matter of fact, they became so involved in the worship of the same God as the God of the Israelites that they formed their own Bible. They formed a Bible which is called the Pentateuch. It's essentially the same as the Pentateuch that we have in the Hebrew Bible. There are differences. The differences are kind of interesting in this regard. There are about, I think I read something like about 2,000 or 1,000 differences. Most of those differences are in spelling or in pronunciation. But as far as the general idea, they're very much the same. There was one thing that was quite different. The people in Samaria were very close to a mountain called Gerizim. They worshipped at that mountain, whereas the people in Israel and in Jerusalem, they worshipped at the mount in Jerusalem. I just looked this up this morning. In going through the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947, among the scrolls they came some of the copies of this Samaritan Pentateuch, or the Samaritan Bible. Actually, Shalmaneser was the one that had moved down into Samaria, but he died. He died before they actually got into Samaria, and he was succeeded by Sargon II. Now, you remember Sargon I? He was the Sargon that we met way back in Mesopotamia around 2300 BC. And this man took on the name Sargon. We don't really know an awful lot about him. Sometimes he claims to be the son of Shalmaneser, other times it's rather vague. But at any rate, what did happen is that Sargon then became the king of the Assyrians, and he is the one that actually was the one that conquered the city of Samaria. Sargon is recognized as one of the most important Neo-Assyrian kings due to his role in founding the Sargonid dynasty. The people that followed him were very significant: Sennecraft, Esarhaddon, and Ashurbanipal, and I'll talk about them in a moment. And they would rule the Neo-Assyrian Empire until it started to fall apart. Sennecraft was the king after, well, I think I do have a slide here that shows something here. After Samaria, well, all the way down to the southern part of Judah here, what happened was that Sargon II went all the way down there. And we believe there are pictures or there's indication in the Bible that he conquered the city of Lachish. Now, the other thing that was rather significant is that he did not conquer Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, when he was on his way to Jerusalem, around 605 BC, he died. And Sennecraft then became the ruler of the Assyrians. And then we have somebody that we know some things about. Sennecraft, around 700 BC, became the king of the Assyrians. And Sennecraft besieged Jerusalem, but failed to capture it. That is the period that we usually look at as the time of the rule by King Hezekiah. There is quite a bit written in the histories about King Hezekiah, and the fact that Hezekiah was able to hold off Sennecraft. Sennecraft besieged the city. Actually, I think he had it under besiege for a couple of years. But don't you think that Hezekiah realized that was going up north, that Jerusalem eventually could have problems, and he prepared for this siege? Among the things that Hezekiah had done was to take into account the fact that Jerusalem was not very easy to conquer, except for one thing. They had no water of their own. And he saw to it that they did have enough water if they were put under siege. And one of the things he did was to build a tower that allowed them to get to the spring that was nearby to get water, and also made a tunnel all the way from that spring all the way through the city of Jerusalem to another place, to a pool where they could get water. In other words, he prepared for this siege. And guess what? He was able to hold off Sennecraft. Until one day Sennecraft just picked up and left. He picked up with his army and left because, according to what we read in the Bible, the angel of death came into Sennecraft's army, which was besieging Jerusalem at that time, and killed thousands of the army of the Assyrians, killed thousands of Sennecraft's army, and Sennecraft decided to leave and went back to Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire at that time. The Bible says he went back to Nineveh, where he was assassinated by his sons. It's true, he was assassinated but not right away by his sons. Let's get back to this slide. Let's take a look at this list again. Here we have Sennecraft. We find out that he came on the scene in 700, but he had to leave because of the fact that his army was being decimated by the angel of death. They don't know really what happened. They think they might have had a plague of some sort. Maybe it was COVID-19 or it's COVID-18 or something came in. It was killing off the Assyrian army, and he left. And he went back to Nineveh. Actually, it was just about 20 years later that he was succeeded by his son Esarhaddon. Now, we don't hear too much about him in the Bible, which is rather peculiar because he was out by far the most successful of all these Neo-Assyrian emperors. He is most famous for his conquest of Egypt. What we find is that with Esarhaddon, here was the old Assyrian Empire. This was the Assyrian Empire up until Tiglath-Pileser. Notice that Judah is not colored here because Tiglath-Pileser did not get him, Sennecraft did not get him. But Esarhaddon actually was able to take the Assyrian Empire all the way down into Egypt. Was that significant? Yes, that was extremely significant. As a matter of fact, by this time you should be putting a couple of things together. Who killed Josiah, the king of Egypt? And it was because Esarhaddon had gotten all the way down to Egypt that actually became rather significant. Esarhaddon was this successful king. He was followed by his son. Now nothing works. He was followed by his son Ashurbanipal. Now, let me just say something here that I find kind of interesting. They say that Esarhaddon, the one that followed Sennecraft, was probably the most successful of all the Assyrian emperors. We don't read that much about him, but if you give the title of being the most successful, what does that suggest? From there on, things go down. They go down. Who was the most successful of all of the kings of Israel? It was David. After David, he was followed by his son Solomon. What did Solomon do? Solomon wasted an awful lot of money on his building projects and things of this sort. Oh, you say, yeah, Solomon built the temple. That's true, he built the temple, but you find out the temple was not as large as the palace that he built for himself at the same time. But what happened after Solomon? It fell apart. It fell apart. Actually, what happens here is kind of interesting. Many centuries later, Esarhaddon brings the Assyrian Empire to its pinnacle, and is followed by his son Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was quite interesting in ways that are a little bit different. He spent money like crazy, but the rest of the world has to thank him because one of the things that he did was spend money on a library. The library in the city of Nineveh, sometimes it's they call the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, was a very special place where, see, that doesn't work anymore. There were stored some 30,000 tablets that mostly were written in cuneiform, were stored in that library. That library was not destroyed. Later, we find out that the city of Nineveh was destroyed. It was not destroyed. And it wasn't until 1849 that the British moved in there and they came across that library and they found all those tablets. I don't know what happened here. I'll just have to tell you what happened. Came across all those tablets. And it's from those tablets that we learned all about the history of Mesopotamia. We would not know anything about Sumer and the very high degree of socialized society that was developed at Sumer. We would not know about the Gilgamesh epic or the Enuma, all of this literature that came through that library. I have a statement somewhere that said that H.G. Wells, and he wrote his History of the World, did say that the discovery of that library is probably one of the most significant things that happened in terms of archaeology in giving us information about a whole period that came out of Ashurbanipal's library. Even though it's kind of easy to get after Ashurbanipal, because the empire did start to fall apart at that time, because if you remember the previous slides, things started to fall apart as far as the Assyrians were concerned. Here's that after Ashurbanipal, we have these three emperors, none of whom was very successful. And as a matter of fact, it wasn't too long before Nineveh itself fell. Nineveh fell. Oh, here's a little bit. Here's the statement that I made about H.G. Wells. Nineveh fell from a combination of the Medes and the Babylonians. They sacked it. The fall of Nineveh led to the destruction of the Neo-Assyrian Empire over the next 3 years. That was around 611, 612, around that period that the Assyrian Empire seemed to be falling apart so badly that guess what? The Assyrians had to get out of Nineveh, and they left Nineveh, and they fled to the west. And as they were going to the west, guess what? The Babylonians were following them. The Babylonians were following them. Now, I think I can get back to Josiah. I want to take a look at this bio of Josiah again. He reigned from 640 when he was 8 years old to 609. He was 39 years old at that time. What happened in 609? He was killed. But what happened before that? He was in his mid-20s when he started to think about certain things. One of the things that he thought about was that book that they had discovered in the temple, that book of Deuteronomy. And he was the one that caused this great reformation that took place in Jerusalem and in Judah at that time, and getting rid of all of these old idols and all these other things. But there was something else that was also on Josiah's mind at that period. Let's go back to that previous slide. This is about the time that Josiah is in his mid-20s, and he's seeing the empire of the Assyrians fall apart. The Assyrians at that time held the territory that had belonged to Israel, had held that territory where we had these 10 tribes that were taken into captivity. That territory that was now held by the Samaritans. The Bible doesn't say too much about this, but apparently what had happened was that Josiah got it in his head. Remember, he's about 30 years old. Got it in his head. If the Assyrians are losing control, why don't we go back into that territory that did belong to the Israelites originally, before they were taken into captivity, and take it back from the Assyrians? What Josiah had in mind was simply this: why not find a way of getting the whole united kingdom that David had, that had both the south with Judah and the north with those 10 tribes, and make that all one kingdom. As much as he had his mind on anything else like that Reformation, he certainly was concerned about this idea, hey, let's get that kingdom back. When he found out, I've got a good drink here. When he learned something, we don't know how he learned it, but he learned that the Egyptians were going up north they were going to help the Assyrians against the Babylonians. You follow me? As the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho were moving to the north, Josiah got it in his mind, I'm going to stop these Egyptians from going up there and helping the Assyrians. I don't want the Assyrians to be successful. I want them to fail. That is why Josiah went and met Pharaoh Necho's army at Megiddo, and that's why he was killed. He was killed right at that time. And that's why everything changed, because of the decision to stop the Egyptians from helping the Assyrians. That is not the end of the story by any means at all. There was another thing that was probably happening at this time that we do not know for sure exactly what the details are. But as this Reformation was being successful, and Josiah was thinking about the dreams of having a united kingdom, what we need now is our history. They had something of a history in the things that they had from the Yahwist and the Elohists, and there were things from the priestly prophets as well, the priestly writings as well. Why don't we write a history of our own, a history of what happened after Moses had taken the Israelites to the River Jordan, and now we're about to conquer Jordan, or take control of Jordan, take control of Canaan. There is one theory, and it's a pretty good theory, and that is this: that may be the time that they started writing the history of the Israelites, which we call the Deuteronomic history. Now, I will be showing a little bit later, in a little bit more detail, some significant aspects about that Deuteronomic history in terms of how it follows the book of Deuteronomy so carefully. But there was one real problem. The Deuteronomic histories cover a period that go all the way from the time that the Israelites crossed the River Jordan all the way to the time that they were in captivity in Babylon. How could that be? That led to the proposition by a guy by the name of Martin North, a German scholar in the 1930s, saying, actually, those Deuteronomic histories had to be written after the Israelites were actually in captivity. On the other hand, there are things that we find in those Deuteronomic histories that indicate that probably they were being written while Josiah was still alive. And they were written to a point, as long as Josiah was alive. When he was dead, it stopped. And then they were picked up again later on. They were picked up again later on to give some added material, which took them all the way to the time of the Messiah. One way or the other, and I'll talk a little bit more about this next week, one way or the other, it is about this time that these Deuteronomic histories were written, about this time that Joshua and Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings were being written. Fascinating thing about these books is that as we read through them, we get indications that whoever this Deuteronomic historian was, he was giving us information about parts of the history of the Israelites that we don't find except in the Deuteronomic histories. As a matter of fact, the Deuteronomic histories were not the only histories. There are also the Chronicles, which also gave a history of the Israelites. And I will ask you this question: how many of you have ever studied the Chronicles or heard sermons from the Chronicles? Don't raise your hand, because you probably haven't. They were not nearly as we want to say definitive in terms of talking about the history as those Deuteronomic histories. Most of us have been brought up with the Deuteronomic histories, and we think about the history of Israel largely in terms of those Deuteronomic histories. A thing to think about right now is this: how much of that writing was being influenced by the period in which it was being written? If it was being written about the time that the Israelites were fighting against the fact that the Babylonians were going to be coming soon, or was it written after the exile, We don't know. But it's kind of interesting to look at these Deuteronomic histories, and we can see indications that whoever was writing this might actually have been there and witnessed some of the things that were happening firsthand. Not the early parts of the history, but some of the latter parts of the history. This is what we're going to be spending quite a bit of time on now. We're not going to talk too much more about history other than where it comes into being, but we're going to start talking about those Deuteronomic histories and about the book of Deuteronomy itself, and what was peculiar about the book of Deuteronomy that led to the Deuteronomic histories. I'm going to read you some passages that come from the last verses of the book of Deuteronomy and show you that there's every single indication that whoever wrote those last verses in the book of Deuteronomy was very likely the same person that wrote the first verses that we have in the book of Joshua, indicating it might have been the same person that was writing about these things. Is this going to be significant? Yeah, because this is a very, what you might say, formative period in the history of the Israelites. And so for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking more at the books themselves, namely the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua, and then somewhat about the book of Judges, and see how they fit into the period in which they were probably being written. Now, what's the question that you should be asking yourself right now? What is that question? Who wrote those? Who was doing all this writing? Who was there that could write all about these things in the past? Where did he get all the information that he had? Where did he get the information about David slaying Goliath, or David finding that he was being attracted to Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, in great detail? Where do we read about this? Where do we read about Saul picking up his sword and throwing it at David? Where did he get that kind of information? And we're going to talk a little bit about how the Deuteronomic histories were put together and how there might have been a person or persons that managed to get that to us. And if you were to take a look at what you know about the Bible, you'd have to admit that you know more about the Old Testament from the Deuteronomic histories than you probably do from anything else. I will also be pointing out at that time how much more accurate the Deuteronomic histories are in terms of history than are the things that we have in the books of Numbers and of Exodus in terms of the migration of the Israelites from Egypt into Canaan, and why there are some of the difficulties that we have in looking at the Torah or at the 5 books of Moses, and why they don't seem to fit so well. I'll give you a quick example of this. Very early in the book of Exodus, we read about what great things Aaron did. And then later on in the same book, we read about the fact that Aaron set up a golden calf for the people to worship. Why do both of those things show up in the Torah? Why do they show up in those books of Moses that were so supposedly written way back? But on the other hand, when we get to the Deuteronomic histories, things seem to be fairly accurate. So next week we're going to take a look at Deuteronomy and at Judges, and look at it in terms of the period that we've just been looking at, in which the Israelites are taken into captivity. I actually have not talked about how they came into captivity. Let me just go back to one slide here. Well, it doesn't seem to show up now. If you recall this one slide that I had, there. Take a look here. This is where the kingdom divided, and the southern kingdom lasted until 609. And that's the time that that was the year that Josiah was killed. And that was the end of the southern kingdom. Then there was a period in which Egypt was in control. And then there was a period where the Babylonians were in control. You see that span there? A span of what? 4 years, more things changed than you can possibly imagine. In that 4 years' time, they went from Egypt to the Babylonians, and then all of a sudden we find out that under the Babylonians, the Israelites were taken into captivity. We'll get into that a little bit later on. This was a very this doesn't show it too well. It's too bad it doesn't show it. Right in this place that I'm pointing at right now was one of the biggest battles that was ever fought in ancient times. A battle between Egypt and a battle between the Babylonians. And guess what? Somewhere in the scriptures, and I've not been able to find it again, it said Egypt was never the power that it had been in the past. And all of a sudden, from that period on, the Egyptian power seems to decrease, and the Babylonians come into power. Then the Persians come into power. Then the Greeks come into power. Then the Romans come into power. But the Egyptians were down. That is in this little period that I haven't written anything. Next week, I'm running out of voice.